Hey, folks, welcome to our study, Connecting the Dots, where we are looking at how the Old Testament and the New Testament connect together. In this last year, the nation of Israel has had three different elections for a prime minister, which would be like our president in their system. And in their system, once a prime minister is elected, that person has to put together a majority government. Benjamin Netanyahu was elected to the office of prime minister, but he could not pull together a majority government within the parliament, and so they had to have a second election. He was elected again, and he was not able to pull together a majority, and so they had a third one, and the same thing happened a third time, and so it looked like they were going to go to a fourth election, which is absolutely unprecedented. But he and Benny Gantz, which was somebody else who was the second runner-up in the election and was trying to put together a majority government. The two of them agreed that they would put together a joint government, or what they would call a unity government. And so in their arrangement, Netanyahu would serve as prime minister for 18 months, and then Benny Gantz would serve as prime minister for 18 months. And so each a year and a half over the 3-year period, and Netanyahu would go first, and so that was the plan. But now there is a dispute as to whether or not Netanyahu can even serve as prime minister, because charges have been brought against him. He's being indicted for illegal activities, but he's denying that the charges have any substance to him, and that he's the subject of a witch hunt, and they're trying to get him out of power. And so it's in another controversy as to whether or not that's all going to work. But, most Americans do not track any of this because it's really not of interest to us in America. But as students of the Bible, it's incredibly important to us. Netanyahu wants to push forward with President Trump's Middle Eastern peace plan, the deal of the century, I think he's calling it. And Netanyahu wants to push that forward. But Benny Gantz wants to wait and bring together the United Nations so that there can be a coalition of nations agreeing to the plan before they move forward. So, because Netanyahu is going to be serving as prime minister for the first 18 months, he wants to push this plan through before his 18 months are completed, so that when Benny Gantz gets into power, it doesn't get stalled. And part of the controversy over this peace plan is that it calls for the annexation of the West Bank, which is territory that is disputed by the Palestinians. And so it would be extending Israel's borders, looking more closely to the 1967 borders. And all of that threatens to raise hostilities in the Middle East, which is already a region of the world that is a powder keg just waiting to explode. Well, all of that has incredible implications for us, because the Jews claim that this land was given to them by God, that He promised it to Abraham, and actually beyond those borders, promised it to Abraham, and it is rightfully theirs. The Palestinians claim that the Jews came in and stole the land from them. The Bible tells us that Israel is God's timepiece that marks God's prophetic calendar. That's why it's important to us as we watch what's happening with Israel in the Middle East. Those can be signs of the nearness of the age of the return of Christ. And so I want to look at the role that Israel will play in the end days, because it will help us to connect the dots between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's also an indication to us of the hour in which we are living. So I want to start by turning to Matthew's Gospel, and then we'll jump back to the Old Testament. But we're going to start with Matthew chapter 24, verse 32. This is right in the middle of a teaching that Jesus gave. But it said, Jesus said these words, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree." And he's going to use the fig tree as an analogy. And the fig tree is speaking specifically about the nation of Israel. And the root of that, the idea from which that sprang, comparing the fig tree to Israel, is that the fig was used as an idea for Israel. Back in Jeremiah's prophecy, in Jeremiah 24, we read these words. Beginning at verse 1, it says, "After Jehoiachin, son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the officials, the craftsmen and the artisans of Judah were carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The Lord showed me 2 baskets of figs placed in front of the temple of the Lord. One basket had very good figs, like those that ripen early. The other basket had very poor figs, so bad they could not be eaten. Then the Lord asked me, 'What do you see, Jeremiah?' Figs, I answered. The good ones are very good, but the poor ones are so bad they cannot be eaten. Then the word of the Lord came to me. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Like these good figs, I regard as good the exiles from Judah, whom I sent away from this place to the land of the Babylonians. My eyes will watch over them for their good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them. I will give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord. They will be my people, and I will be their God, for they will return to me with all their heart. But like the poor figs, which are so bad they cannot be eaten, says the Lord, so will I deal with Zedekiah, king of Judah, his officials, and the survivors from Jerusalem, whether they remain in this land or live in Egypt. So the fig was a symbol of Israel coming back into the land after the Babylonian exile. And they were there for 70 years of captivity under the Babylonians, but they would return to the land, but then they would again be scattered from the land a second time, which is the deportation that we know happened in two stages. In 70 AD, the Romans came in and sacked Jerusalem, but it was in 135 AD that they were pushed out of the land and scattered throughout the world. So Jesus used the fig tree as a prophecy as a symbol of Israel, and he tied that to a prophecy regarding his return to earth again, his second coming. So back in Matthew now, chapter 24, verse 32, it says, as soon as its twigs, this is the fig tree, as soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. So this is a symbol of Israel coming into the land, and you got to keep in mind that there are technically three deportations, but really two. The first was when the northern kingdom of Israel was deported into Assyria. So you have 12 tribes of Israel, 10 in the north, which was known formally as Israel, and then 2 in the south, which was known as Judah. And so the 10 northern tribes were deported to Assyria. Then the second captivity came when the 2 southern tribes were deported to Babylon. And some people see the deportation into Assyria and the deportation into Babylon really as being joined together into one, because the people who were deported to Assyria never actually returned from Assyria, but the southern tribes were deported to Babylon. Then the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, and so the 10 northern tribes, in a sense, were absorbed into that. And then when they all came back at the end of the Babylonian captivity, some of those from the Assyrian captivity came back as well. So that's really one exile, in a sense, and then one return from exile. But then they're scattered to the world again in 135 AD. And Isaiah prophesied that they would return from their captivity. But he makes an interesting statement in his prophecy. In Isaiah 11:11, it says, in that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that is left of his people from Assyria. So he's saying he's going to reclaim them a second time. The first time was when they were reclaimed from Babylon, but now this is the second time. And notice verse 11 says that he will reclaim the remnant that is left from Assyria, Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. So he's going to reclaim them, all of those that are scattered everywhere. He's going to reclaim them a second time. So when Israel returned to the land after the Babylonian captivity, that was the first and only time that they had returned to the land. All right, and by the time that happened, Isaiah had already written this prophecy. So Isaiah says they're going to come back into the land, and they did come back into the land after the Babylonian captivity, but it says they're going to come back into the land a second time. Well, when they came back into the land from Babylon, that was the first time. All right, so Isaiah is speaking really about another return after another deportation. Well, as I said, the second deportation was in 135, and Israel did not return to the land a second time until 1948. So Jesus' prophecy about the end of the age in Matthew 24 is connected to Israel coming into the land in 1948, because Isaiah said they would come back into the land a second time. When Jesus was prophesying in Matthew 24, they had already returned from Babylon and had been living in the land. After Jesus dies and is resurrected and ascended into heaven, they'll be scattered to the world in 135 AD, and then the second return will be in 1948 when they come back into the land. So Jesus' prophecy about the end of the age in Matthew 24 is connected to Israel coming back into the land in 1948. Now, Isaiah chapter 66, verses 6 and 7 says this: Before she goes into labor, she gives birth. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Who has ever heard of such a thing? Who has ever seen such things? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. It says, can a country become a nation in one day? And yet that's exactly what happened. In one day, Israel became a nation and then returned to the land. May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel is born. The magazine or news article says born, but it's actually reborn. On this historic day, David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister, the first prime minister of modern Israel, announced Independence Day, and he publicly read what was called the Proclamation of the Establishment of the State of Israel. And he read it over the radio, and this is what it said, among other things. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, the spiritual, religious, and national identity is formed. Here, they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here, they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. Exiled from Palestine, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all the countries of dispersion, never ceasing to pray and hope for the return and restoration of their national freedom. Accordingly, we, the members of the National Council, met together in solemn assembly today, and by virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people, and with the support of the resolution of the General of the United Nations, hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel. We offer peace and amity to all neighboring states and their peoples, and invite them to cooperate with the independent Jewish nation for the common good of all. With trust in the Rock of Israel, we set our hands to this declaration at this session of the Provisional State Council in the city of Tel Aviv on Sabbath Eve, 5th ER 5708, the 14th day of May, 1948. So this is Israel returning to the land a second time. This is only the second time after a deportation that they've returned to the land. So they were deported to Babylon and returned. And then in 1935, they were deported to the ends of the earth. And the very first time they came back together again as a nation was in 1948. That's what Isaiah was talking about in Isaiah 11:11 when he said, in that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that is left of his people from, notice it's a remnant, and they're scattered from Assyria, Egypt, Cush, Elam, Babylonia, Hamath, and even the islands of the sea. They're scattered all throughout the world. Well, Israel was scattered in 135 AD throughout the world, and they stayed that way for over 1,000 years. Before 1948, there were 40,000 Jews living in what we call Palestine. By 1948, there were 500,000 Jews living there, and today there are over 6 million Jews living there. There are now more Jews living in Israel than there are living in the United States. So, keeping all that in mind, talking about the fig tree, Jesus said this. In Matthew 24:33, he said, even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. So he says, when you see these things, when you see the fig leaf starting to blossom, it is near. And the question would be, what is it? And what is near? Well, if you read the context of this passage, it's very clear. The very two verses just before that statement, which would be Matthew 24, verse 30 and 31, say this. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. So that's talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ, when he's going to gather up the Jews who are alive on the earth at that time at the end of the millennial reign of Christ. Jesus went on to say in Matthew 24:34, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So he's saying we're going to see all of this start to unfold, and this generation, when this leaf starts to blossom, that generation's not going to pass away until this stuff starts to unfold. Well, a generation in the Bible, there's different discussions about what a generation is, but the Bible puts it somewhere around 80 years. Israel became a nation in 1948, and so this year marks the 72nd year since Israel has become a nation. And so that could seem to indicate that maybe the time is drawing near when things are going to start to unfold. Now, it'll be a 1,000-year reign of Christ, and then the second return of Jesus at the end of that 1,000 years. So in a sense, we have 1,000 years yet before the actual second coming of Christ at the end of the millennial reign of Christ. But the beginning of that begins with the rapturing of the church, and then the ushering in of the tribulation, and when God starts to call Israel to be his people, and all of these things that deal with Israel. All of that gets started when the tribulation is kicked off. And he's saying that a generation will not pass until they get started. Did he mean 80 years? Well, I mean, we don't know. In the Bible, a generation was roughly 80 years, so the implications are that it could be, though again, as I've said over and over, prophecy is one of those things that's most easily understood when you're standing on the other side of it looking back than when you're trying to look forward. But as we look forward and try to understand what it means, this seems to make sense. Now, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, in this very same passage, he said, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So we don't know the day or the hour, but we can know the season. In Matthew 16:2 and 3, Jesus said, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? So he's saying there are signs that point that things are getting near, and you ought to be able to discern that. And as we look at the signs that are happening, it seems to indicate the time is drawing near. And Israel is a key figure in that as we watch what happens in the Middle East. Becoming a nation in 1948 was not the only prophecy concerning Israel. There are several others, and we'll see each of them coming to pass. We see each of those coming to pass in our day, and so we'll take a look at those in further studies. But as we look at what is happening in the Middle East today, and compare that to Scripture, we get an indication of just how near we are to the day of the Lord's return. And so we'll continue to look at the Old Testament prophecies and how they're fulfilled in the New and how they're unfolding in our day and age as well. And all of that adds up to say it looks like. I wouldn't say with absolute certainty because we know none of us can know the future, but it looks like things are adding up to say we are entering into that season. So we'll tune in next time to look at more of this as we seek to connect the dots. God bless you.